This is 6.3 Data Ethics. It is the last section in Chapter 6 before your test. So when we talk about experimentation, it's very, very important to also talk about the ethics behind experimenting. Doing a taste testing experiment where you give somebody Coke or Pepsi is not really something unethical as long as the person is not allergic to it. However, if somebody is very, very allergic to peanut M&Ms, you would not want to do a taste test experiment where you give them plain and peanut and see which one they like better. Of course, the problem being, if somebody's very allergic to something, it would be unethical to give it to them without them letting them know. So scientists and statisticians have to be very, very careful when setting up experiments so that they are not being unethical or they don't actually cause harm to people. So we're going to study ethics today in this section. Most of the time, we're able to give one group a treatment and one group a placebo with no real ethics being violated. However, sometimes when there are serious illnesses, it can be very tricky to be ethical, to be objective, that kind of thing. Just think about if you had to give somebody a cancer treatment and it was part of a study and you have these two really, really sick kids, maybe 5 years old, both of them. One gets the treatment and one gets a fake treatment, and it can be very, very hard on somebody to give a 5-year-old sick kid a fake treatment on purpose. One of the most weird things that have happened in the past is something called sham surgeries. So if you know that you're going to have a surgery for whatever reason, maybe you have a bad heart and you have to do a heart bypass or something like that. So you kind of know when you have surgery. You go in, they give you anesthesia, and then you usually have, a scar of some kind. So what happens if there's a placebo effect with surgeries? What if the fact that just that you think you're getting fixed is enough to make you get fixed? Well, they started doing things called sham surgeries, which basically means you have two people. One person goes in, gets cut open, and has the procedure done. Their heart is fixed, their gallbladder is removed, or whatever it is that they were doing. The other group gets cut open and then gets sewn right back up, and nothing gets done to them. And they did this as a way to have a control group. So you kind of understand scientifically why they would do that. Well, now you've got the scar, so that placebo effect might take into account. And so maybe you'll start feeling better just because you've had this surgery. However, you can understand that this is very sketchy, at least in ethics, because if you're going to go through the risk of surgery and going through anesthesia and getting injured, basically getting cut open and then sewn back up, it can be very scary to think that maybe they did absolutely nothing to you. So what are ethical practices in statistics? This is something that's very important for those of you, especially if you're going to go into the medical field. What can you do? What can't you do? And still get good data to see if your practice is going to work. Well, first of all, if you're going to do any kind of experimentation on people, you have to go through an institutional review board. They're going to review all that you're planning on doing. You have to tell them in advance, and then you have to tell them what you're going to be doing to your subjects. And of course, if they have any questions or anything sounds iffy, they're going to stop or make you redo your program so that it wouldn't be unethical. Secondly, if you're working with people, you have to give them informed consent before you can start doing this. So maybe if you've ever participated in a study or anything like that, you may have been told your informed consent, which basically means it has to tell you, any issues that might come into play, what could happen, what kind of treatments are going on, that kind of stuff. And then when you're doing experiments on people, you have to keep their information confidential. So they can't say, oh, I was experimenting on Kelly Jones and we did this to her, and you just don't want to do that. You want to make sure that whoever was in your study, you're going to keep them confidential. So institutional review boards the job basically is to review the plans of the experimenters on human subjects, and they're basically trying to protect the rights and welfare of the human subjects. So they want people to work or to be part of the studies, but they also want to make sure that they are protected. They can require experimenters to make changes review consent forms, and make sure all the possible risks are discussed. All right, for informed consent, if an experiment is medical in nature, you first of all have to discuss any potential risks. So if you're going to do a surgery on somebody, you would say, hey, there's a chance that we cut you open and we don't do anything. So if you're going to do something like that, you have to let people know so they know what they're signing up for. If it's a survey, you have to tell somebody how long it's going to be and how long it will take and the types of questions. Because if you're just doing like a Chick-fil-A survey, that's not as in-depth as maybe one that talks about your drug or alcohol or cigarette study or usage of minors. Obviously, this would be more a touchy subject that you wouldn't want people to know about. Subjects always have to give their consent in writing, so they need a signature basically before they can start doing this. And it can't just be over the phone, or it can't be a text, and it can't be online. They actually have to sign something. Now, who could actually give informed consent? Who can actually consent to doing something? So you might want to think about, who are you asking? Obviously, minors really can't give their own consent most of the time because, maybe, especially if it's medical in nature, they may not understand the depths of what they're actually going to do to you. But what if they're not minors? What if they're now 18, but maybe they're mentally disabled? Are they informed enough? Do they actually know what's going on enough? Is their ability to make decisions strong enough where they could make decisions for themselves, or do they still maybe need a guardian to help them? And then also it gets tricky if you have somebody who comes in who is unconscious and they need treatment, but they can't give consent, obviously, because, they're not awake. Confidentiality. Once the experiment is complete, they must keep individual responses confidential. That means you can't report an average, and you could state an average improvement, or you could say what percent favored something, but you can't tell me what an individual said. Note, this is not the same as anonymous or anonymity. Your name will appear in the study, but we will not report your reactions or responses individually. Anonymous would mean that your name's not attached to it at all. All right, so a lot of polling that you may be familiar with is when it's a presidential election or a presidential campaign. Normally, when you're watching presidential campaigns or you're trying to avoid them, you start hearing polls that have come out and who is ahead and who's behind and by what number of points. But as you might guess, whoever's doing the polls usually have an agenda, and we have to talk about what they actually have to give. So what kind of standard informed consent should a pollster be required to tell the people they call or see on the street when they're asking them questions? Well, most except by polling organizations require that you give the respondents the name and address of the organization that's carrying out the poll. So this is probably required so that you know it is a real organization and not some crazy person on the street trying to get your opinion. And then also, have a way to get in touch with them if they give you the name and the address. If you have questions, or you were treated unfairly, or if you were berated because of your responses, you just have a way to get in touch with them to complain. Many times, polling organizations use a professional name like Samples Incorporated or something like that, so respondents don't know who is actually paying for the survey, because most of you know that if it is a political survey, it is going to be paid by a political party. So Republicans, Democrats, or independents may be actually paying for the survey, but they don't want to say, hey, we're Republicans, or hey, we're Democrats, because they feel that may influence the study in some way or the other, or maybe you wouldn't want to respond to them or something like that. So basically, they try not to tell you who pays for the survey, but creates a front company to sound like some third party that's going to be gathering the data. Once the results are made public, should they be required to say which party said it? Well, you probably could figure out. So if it's a Republican candidate who is winning, it's probably paid by the Republicans, and if it's a Democrat, then it's probably paid for the Democrats. Some common practices may appear to offer anonymity while actually delivering only confidentiality. So sometimes you might get a sample in the mail, and it'll ask you, hey, what TV shows do you watch? Or, hey, what kind of medications do you take? Or different things like that. So when they send a mail survey, they may not ask for your name, but they actually have a code somewhere on the questionnaire, and they know that that code is tied to that address that they sent that mail to. In this case, they should not tell you that you are anonymous, because they do have a way to track you. Now, they may not know who in the household actually filled out that survey, but they know somebody in that household filled it out. So that could kind of break your claim of anonymity if they tell you it is. So basically, all they can tell you is, if they have a code on there, that your answers might be kept confidential. When they say it's confidential, remember, your name or your address might be attached to it, but they would not say, hey, your household answered this way on number 1. They can't say specifically how you answered on something. Now, if they don't tell you that there is a code, it could actually lead you to think that you're anonymous, since you didn't actually put your name on there. So there's some ethics that are involved there. Clinical trials are experiments that are studying effectiveness of medical treatment on actual patients. So anytime we're talking about clinical trials, obviously it is medical in nature. You need to be comparative, and you need to be randomized experiments. So that means you have to give certain people certain drugs and certain people other types of drugs. These give us great benefits for future patients, obviously. So if we're doing, once again, a cancer treatment, it's scary for the people who are actually being tested on right then and there, because you may end up with a placebo, or you may end up with a drug that's not as effective. So it puts individual people at risk. It is important to know that. But it also is trying to help tons and tons of future patients by the results. Unfortunately, since it is actually a risk to individual people, you have to take them into account. So anytime you're doing a clinical trial, when you give that informed consent, you have to tell them specifically, like, 60 patients are going to get a placebo and 60 patients are going to get a real treatment. Now, they don't have to tell you which is which. Actually, that will change the whole study if they tell you that you have the placebo or not. But you do have to tell them, what's the probability that you're going to get the placebo, that kind of stuff. Interest of the subjects must always prevail over the interest of science and society. So if you have a patient who is getting a placebo and they're getting worse and worse and worse, and they wish to drop out of the trial because perhaps they've figured out that they have the placebo, or they're not getting better regardless of the treatment, so they want to try another method, you have to let them go. You can't just say, no, you have to be in the study, and you don't want to pressure them to stay because it's their life. And so ethically, you don't want to force people to stay in a study if they don't want to be. All right, now this page number is wrong. It's actually page 299. But example 6.20 is actually kind of an interesting study. We'll read that together. Stanley Milgram of Yale conducted a famous experiment to see if a person will perform acts under group pressure that he would not have performed in the absence of social inducement. The subject arrives with 3 others, unknown to the subject, are confederates of the experiment. The experimenter explains that he's studying the effects of punishment on learning. So the learner, who's one of the confederates, is strapped into an electric chair, mentioning in passing that he has a mild heart condition. The subjects and the 2 other confederates are teachers. They sit in front of the panel with switches that label from slight shock to danger severe shock, and they're told they must shock the learner whenever he fails in a memory learning task. How badly the learner is shocked is up to the teachers and will be the lowest level suggested by any teacher in that trial. All this is rigged. The learner answers incorrectly on 30 of the 40 questions. The 2 teacher confederates call for a higher shocking level each failure. As the shock increases, the learner protests, asking to be let out, shouts, complains of heart trouble, and screams in pain. The shocks are all phony, and the learner is actually an actor. But the person who's being experimented on, or one of the teachers, doesn't know this. What will this subject do? He can keep the shock at the lowest level, but the other two teachers are pressuring him to punish the learner for failing. The subject usually gives in to the pressure. While the experiment yields wide variation in performance, a substantial number of subjects submitted readily to pressure applied to them by the Confederates. And it also noted that after they were done with the experiment, the person who was being experimented on would report having trauma almost about having to make this decision to shock this person who's obviously in pain, but they also didn't want to let down the other two people who keep saying, oh no, let's shock them more and more and more. So this experiment is not actually on the person in the electric chair. This person is actually, the experimented one is the person who's one of the teachers. Everybody else is in on it. Everybody else knows nobody's getting hurt. And there's actors, basically. All right, so this is okay in the fact that it's not giving you physical harm. The person who's sitting there deciding how high to shock somebody is not actually getting hurt. But it does cause some emotional harm. The person truly believes they're hurting somebody. And they might feel guilty. Was there informed consent? Part of the getting the results here is not knowing that the subject was actually the subject. He thought, or she thought, that they were the ones doing the testing. So right now, this would not be ethical because you couldn't have got correct informed consent. But an informed consent would have messed up the experiment. This type of experiment would be considered unethical now and would be turned down by a review board. But back in the 1960s, this was okay, and this actually was an experiment that was carried out several times, as you can tell from this example, because they talk about how many of the patients actually kept saying to shock higher at that each level. All right. So your questions on your homework are going to be more opinions, but I want you guys to know that I do not want yes or no answers. You always have to explain your reasoning behind it. So let's look at this one. At present, there is no vaccine for a serious viral disease. A vaccine is developed and appears effective in animal trials, and only in a comparative study with human subjects in which a control group receives a placebo can determine the true worth of the vaccine. Is it ethical to give subjects the placebo which cannot protect against the disease? So here you can take the object, or you could take the study and say, yes, it's ethical to not give both the treatment. Because right now nobody's getting the vaccine anyway, so I think it's ethical. Others of you may say, oh, no, this is not ethical, because if we really think it should help somebody, then why would I give somebody a placebo, and then they think they're treated for it, and then they go get exposed to it, and then they could, get hurt or die or whatever it is that this disease is doing. So when you're doing these kind of questions, the kind of answers I'm looking for is to take a stand. So maybe I say it's unethical, but I have to give a reason why. I could say these people think they are treated and could expose themselves to the disease, or the disease. So this is a full response that I'm wanting on your answers for your homework. So don't just tell me it's unethical or it's ethical and leave it at that. I always want a reason behind it. And your reason has to go with the word problem. You can't say it's unethical because unicorns are people too, because nowhere in this experiment did we actually talk about unicorns. Okay, so you have to actually look like you read the word problem and you've made a decision whether you think it's ethical or not. Now, that's not to say that all of your homework is opinions. There are some questions on your homework, like number 68 is yes or no questions. And so you have to read it and decide if it is or not. And then number 70 actually wants you to tell me if something is anonymous, confidential, or both. And so there is a correct answer there. So it's not just your opinion on number 70. It is either anonymous, confidential, or both. And you have to decide one and tell me why. The rest of them usually are opinion questions. So they're asking you, do you think it's ethical or not? And you have to go from there. One last example. A psychologist conducts the following experiment. She measures the attitude of subjects towards cheating and then has them play a game that's rigged so that you can only win if you cheat. The computer that organizes the game also records, unknown to the subjects, whether or not they cheat. Then attitudes toward cheating is retested. So basically, the experiment asks you if you believe cheating is okay, then gives you a game where you have to cheat in order to win, or you just lose every time, and then it asks you again what you think about cheating. So basically, it's tempting you to cheat. And the subjects are led to believe that they are cheating in secret and nobody knows about it. However, they actually are being observed. So do you think this experiment is ethically objectionable? And then tell me your position. So once again, you would say, okay, yes, I think this is unethical because they're recording them and they don't know about it. It's trying to make them cheat. And, you know, what if you think cheating is a sin and then, oh, now you've made them do this and it's so horrible. So that's one way to look at it. Others of you may say, well, you know, I really don't see it's such a big deal. It's just cheating on an online game, so it's not hurting anybody. And, you know, people can cheat or not. They don't have to cheat. They could just lose. So your position is important. You have to tell me what you believe, unethical or ethical, and then tell me why. And remember that it has to do with the word problem, and it has to make sense. So this is what your homework is going to be. On page 303, starting with 67 through 71, remember all of them need to have more than just ethical or unethical. And then remember on 68, these are yes or no questions. You don't have to explain those on number 68. And then on number 70, there's only one correct answer. So we did talk about all of that. If you have any questions about the homework, you can post it on the discussion board below. But really, I think this is very straightforward. And like I said, a lot of it is basically just your opinion of whether you think something has gone too far and should be considered unethical, or if you think something is okay and it is ethical based on what it's trying to study.